Thank you so much, guys. This is actually, I mean, many of you know, I was really involved in organizing the Polyglot Conference for about 5 years of my life. 5 very, very special years in which all of you guys played a really important role. And then as of last year, I decided and had a long conversation with Richard to just take a little bit of a step back, work on some other things, and let some other projects happen. So this has been really fun this year to actually be here as a civilian and be here as one of you guys and get to enjoy it. But just before I kind of start talking, I did want to also use this opportunity to say, you know, I mean, I remember what it's like to be here not as a civilian. And I remember what it's like to be here on call the whole time. And the last 2 nights that I've been in this wonderful continent, I've been flatmates with Richard. And I know how much work is going into making this conference happen because I see Richard up every night until 1 in the morning, sending emails, writing instructions, checking everything's okay, then getting up at 6 so he can be here again. Like, he's really, really putting in a lot of work, as is Tim. It's a lot of work, so I think I'd just really like to say thank you to both of them for all of the work that they've done. I'd also like to say that these were the clearest instructions on how to get to a location I've ever received ever in my life. I was walking through Hakata Station with my phone out being like, oh, here's the next picture. Put my money in the machine. What happens? Oh, get the change. You know, I've never, ever experienced such clear instructions. And so that takes an awful lot of thought and a lot of care and foresight to think about the fact that those are the things that matter on the day. So really good job, Tim and Richard. It's been absolute fantastic. Yeah. Okay. But today we're here to talk about a subject which has been on my mind for quite a long time. Okay, and this is the subject of personalities and polyglottery. I really dislike the word polyglottery, but we miss something in English that Greek caps beautifully. In Greek we just say polyglossia, and it just makes perfect sense. But in English we kind of say polyglottery, polyglottism, polyglossia. I don't know, it's a mess. The English language is a mess. But nonetheless, we know what we're talking about, the abstract noun that relates to polyglots and to people that speak multiple languages. And the question that I'm asking today, and going to explain to you a little bit, is when we speak multiple languages, do we have multiple personalities? Does our personality change as we speak other languages? And as that happens, what would that look like? So first of all, how many people here would say that they speak multiple languages? Tough crowd. And how many people here would say that when they speak multiple languages, they've experienced this sensation of having multiple personalities? Okay. Now, how many people would say that they just have multiple personalities? No, you don't have to answer that question. But I think there should be a control group. So, yeah, so it's interesting. So basically, for the record of the guys watching on YouTube, everybody's put their hands up basically for both questions, right? We've all had some sort of experience like this in speaking multiple languages. Well, Alexander's shaking his head. The other day, Alexander and I were the only 2 people in a workshop who put up our hands at the question of who has never had problems learning a language. But it was a joke, guys. So we've all kind of had that experience. We've all been through that, and we all have a sense that possibly when we speak another language, some sort of new personality kicks in. So let's try and break that open, and let's see what that looks like. Now, when I was talking to people about this presentation, they were like, oh, what are you talking about? I said, oh, I'm talking about personalities and multilingualism. And they're like, oh, you're going to talk about Vic and Stein again, aren't you? And I was like, oh, well, I could talk about Vic and Stein, because he did say some interesting things about this, like... Die Sprache verkleidet den Gedanken, und zwar so, dass man nach der äußeren Form des bekleideten Gedankens schließen kann, weil die äußere Form des Kleides nach ganz anderen Zwecken gebildet ist, als danach die Form des Körpers erkennen zu lassen. I don't know if you noticed a shift in my personality then, but we'll come back to that. Language disguises the thought so that the external form of the clothes, one cannot infer the form of the thought they clothe, because the external... So you see basically where I'm going with this. Wittgenstein is not the central foundation of this talk, and Wittgenstein is not actually the person who inspired this talk for me. The person who inspired this talk for me is someone far more impressive and far more important than Wittgenstein, which was my Aunt Gladys. Now, my Aunt Gladys, actually Gladys, despite her name, was from Lebanon. And Gladys married into my family. She married my uncle, who was from Greece. And I knew Gladys right at the end of her life, when she was in her 90s. She passed away 4 years ago, actually, around the time of the Polyglot conference in New York. But she lived a very, very, very long and multilingual life. And Gladys was the first polyglot that I ever met, because Gladys spoke 5 languages completely fluently. She spoke her native language, French, which she spoke with a thick Arabic accent. It was wonderful. She said, "Je parle français comme ça." And I went back to school in the UK and said, "Bonjour, madame, je vais parler le français comme ça." And they said, "Stop it. You're going to get in trouble." And I said, "Mais ma tante parle comme ça, et sa langue maternelle est le français, donc je parlerai comme ça." Anyway, it lasted about a week, and then I got bored of it. But she really inspired me with her thick, thick, thick Arabic French. And of course, the other language she spoke was Arabic. She also spoke Greek. She lived in Athens for the second half of her life. She spoke English, and she spoke Italian. Now, when I met her, which is when she was about 90, 91, 92, she spoke all of these languages at exactly the same time and had no idea which language she was ever speaking, ever. And I remember once we were at her flat and her sister Mimi was visiting from Beirut, and she wanted to tell us that Mimi was really getting on her nerves. So she stood at the kitchen table like this, deep in thought. And then she said, "Mimi is really annoying," in English. And Mimi said, "Why did you say that?" And she said, "Oh, I thought I was speaking Greek. This keeps happening." So to speak to Gladys in the latter stages of her life, you needed to be able to at least understand English, Greek, Arabic, Italian, and French to be able to have a meaningful conversation. And I thought that this was the coolest person I have ever, and probably will ever meet. Now, while Mimi was visiting and we went round, and I remember Gladys actually made us these croissants with cheese, which was really nice. She kept saying, "Je les ai fait moi-même." Which means she put the cheese in and put it in the toast. She was very proud. But she came out with a really important piece of information, a really important nugget that stayed with me my whole life and inspired this talk, which was this. Chaque langue qu'on parle est une autre personnalité. Every language we speak is another personality. This was Gladys's experience as a quinquilingual polyglot in her 90s who'd lived all over the world. She really believed that each one of the languages that she spoke gave her a different soul, just as we heard. Hoeveel talen as jy kan, soveel male as jy man. Thank you, Lindy, for that one. However many languages you speak, so many more times are you a man. I'm not very good at translating from Afrikaans. But this was her experience as well. And this was the question that I began to ask myself. So, to give you a bit of an idea about how this question played out in my mind and how this question affected my development as a language learner and also as a human, I'm going to talk to you about the 3 languages which I speak best and how this idea really kind of affected these. So these are, of course, Greek, German, and Russian. So let's start with Greek. The first thing that's really important for me to tell you about my relationship with Greek is that I am a heritage speaker of Greek, and I grew up in a bicultural family where we had both British culture and Greek family as well, and Greek culture. So that had quite an important effect on me, because not only was I exposed to the one culture, but also I was exposed to the other, and I was used to actually blending the 2 cultures a lot in my 2 lives. However, when I was growing up and I was speaking Greek, I thought that it was very, very clear what the difference is between English, where I always felt very reserved, out of place, and like it was constantly raining, and Greek were. To me, Greek was this magical language that I could speak and set myself free. I felt like I could express myself. I felt like there was a cultural expectation that I should be more extroverted when I speak Greek. I mean, you know, there's so many kind of words and expressions that exist in Greek that don't exist in English, which make me feel that. Like, for example, if you want to kind of suggest an opinion in Greek, many times you use the word to say. So you say les oti, which means do you say that? And we say that instead of do you think that? And also if we want to say, you know, oh, I heard there's a good restaurant nearby, you say people say there's a good restaurant nearby. There's just all this idea of kind of, you know, just people being around and community and sharing, and it just felt extroverted. It felt like that. You know, and actually, just returning to the bicultural context, often people are very surprised when they learn that I have Greek heritage, especially Greeks. And most recently, I was in Athens with some friends of mine from the UK, and we went to a cafe in Exarchia. And the waitress came over, and I ordered in Greek, and then asked my friends what they wanted in English, and then ordered in Greek. And she said, wait, do that again. I said, what? She said, speak English, then speak Greek, and then speak English again. So I did. And she said, it's so weird, you know? She said, when you speak English, you look like a foreigner, but when you speak Greek, you look Greek. And then when you speak English again, you look English again. And I was like, this has absolutely nothing to do with the way I look, you know? Because I have not changed at all in those 3 sentences. Anyway, so just as a kind of anecdote. But yeah, so Greek was expressive, it was extroverted, it was about family, it was about community. Community is really important in Greece, as is family. I mean, for example, I have an enormously extended Greek family. We have people all over the world. My Greek family actually lived in Egypt, and after the Suez crisis spread everywhere. My strand of the family came to the UK, but I have relatives in Los Angeles, in Paris, Australia, everywhere you can think of. And every now and then someone gets married, and hundreds of us descend on the beaches of Glyfada in Athens and kind of dance all night and drink fire water. And, you know, it's really interesting then because I have so many people who I know are related to me, but I can't really explain what my relationship to those people are. Because in Greek, we only have one word that we use for that, which is xaderphos, which means cousin. And it doesn't matter if it's your 14th cousin 32 times removed, it's still your cousin. We just don't make a distinction in spoken everyday Greek, even though obviously the concept exists, you know. You know, and more things about the Greek personality. I always felt like I was more rebellious. I mean, I once kind of committed a traffic offence while listening to London Greek radio while driving because I think I was thinking in Greek. I mean, that's what I was going to tell the police. And I always felt freer in Greek, and so did my mum. We always used to talk about this, how Greek felt free because the word order was free, because we could put the words wherever we wanted. We could put the verb at the start, put the noun, whatever we wanted to do, we could do it. So we could form sentences in ways that English just did not let us do. Let's talk about German. You experienced my German personality briefly just now. German I learnt at school, and I also did a lot of school exchanges later, and German always felt, surprise, surprise, logical. What do I mean by that? I mean, words in German, I've always thought German is a very democratic language because very complex and long words are actually understandable to the average German speaker if you just break them down. Like, for example, the word pneumonia in English is kind of really, no one knows what that means unless you speak Greek, and then you know pneuma and all this kind of thing. Whereas in German, you just say Lungenentzündung, and it just makes perfect sense. It's kind of the inflammation of the lungs, you know. So German always felt very logical, and it always felt democratic to me. And it also felt, you know, I always felt like I had to be very organized in German because of the word order, and I felt I had to know when my participles are going, I had to know when the word's going to the end, I had to know when I was doing my inversions, you know. It's like basically being your own accountant speaking German. You have to know where everything's going, and you have to have everything ready when you need to show it, you know. But I also, just to kind of counteract some of the cultural cliches, always thought German was a super fun language, you know. I had amazing times visiting Germany as a teenager, causing lots of havoc in Hamburg. And, you know, I also noticed that in German there didn't seem to be such a big distinction between the word for fun and the word for funny. So when our German exchanges would tell us that, you know, oh, today we went to the theme park and it was so funny. I was like, was it? Because in German you just say lustig, right, for both. And it can be quite, you know, broad. Let's talk about Russian. I learnt Russian intensively at university for 1 year and then spent a year in provincial Russia living with a Russian family. It was really cold, but we had a great time. And my experience of Russian was that I always felt like it was a very reflective language. I always thought it was a very kind of good philosophical language. You know, the verbs of motion in Russian require you to know whether someone has come back from the place they went to before you started talking about it. And that was always confusing. I once went on a trip to Russia with 2 friends of mine, and we were staying in this slightly dubious hostel. And this drunk man stormed into our room and started shouting at us in Russian. So we got him out, and then, you know, I had to go and complain about this. So I went over to the people at the front desk and said, «Извините, какой-то пьяный, беззубный мужик только что вошел в нашу комнату и испугал девушек». I said, you know, some sort of kind of drunk, toothless bloke just stumbled into our room and scared the girls. And they were horrified, and they said, how could you leave the girls there with that man? I said, no, he left again. I just used the wrong verb of motion. Like, I didn't put them in danger. He's, you know, vchadil, he left again. Anyway, so this is the kind of thing that was going on there. And I always felt like it was expressive because we were studying a lot of Russian literature. And the way that we learned so much Russian is we memorized poetry a lot. So we learned all of these important and kind of expressive words, and the depth of expression that was always available in Russian really struck me. For example, the verb priatkrit dver means to open the door, but not quite open it fully, just open it a little bit. These sort of things were really, really cool. So that was my idea about how personality was developing in these languages. I felt in Greek I could be free and rebellious. In German I could be logical and organized. In Russian I could be expressive and kind of reflective and kind of a deep thinker. Okay. But actually one of the things that I found very difficult when I moved to Russia is that I encountered another side to the Russian language, which was this thing about being quite direct, being less sensitive to rudeness, and just, you know, getting your point across. And one of the hardest things was being in a cafe and trying to get someone's attention to bring you the bill, because we'd all be there kind of like nervous English people on student visas going, izvinite, ignored for hours and hours and hours. And then we watched what the Russians did, and the Russians just went, Девушка, which means girl, but not like girl, like girl, you know, like, so I didn't know if I felt comfortable saying that, right? I have to like be like, girl, bring me my coffee. But you know what, I decided clearly this was just an unformed part of my burgeoning Russian personality, and to become a successful Russian speaker, I was just gonna have to learn to be really rude. So I was really rude to everyone, and they were rude back, but we never had a fight, we never hit each other, so it was probably fine. And then one day, a friend of mine who'd grown up in Russia, but lived in the UK and then studied with me at university, came to visit her grandparents in Moscow, and I took the 4-hour train to Moscow to hang out with her. And we went to the mall, and we needed to buy something, and we didn't know where the shop was. And I just remember she went up to the security guard, who was this gruff-looking kind of Russian guy with a beard and all sorts of muscles. And I was like, okay, well, I know what I would say. I'd be like, man, where shop? Instead, she went, извините, пожалуйста, будьте добры, вы не можете мне сказать, где находится магазин? I was like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm just asking him where the shop is, right? Because she'd been saying, oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry to bother you. Like, could I possibly ask you a question? You wouldn't happen to know where the shop was. And his reaction was he broadened into this amazing smile and said, of course, young woman, it's just down here on the left. And I was kind of like, oh, hang on a minute. Okay, the last 6 months, I've been so rude to every single person in this country, and they've been so rude back to me, and now you're telling me that was a choice. Okay. So that instance, actually, started to put in my mind a question about how I had been speaking this language, and a question about how I'd been narrating to myself the experience of being a multilingual person. Because it wasn't actually that Russian was making me rude, I was making Russian rude, right? Important difference, which meant kind of, let's go back to this question of, do different languages really give us different personalities? Or is that really what's going on? Because I was living in a provincial town in Russia, about 200 kilometers from Moscow, where people spoke like that. But people in Moscow who were educated and who had good jobs and who kind of respected other human beings did not speak like that, right? Which meant that even within this culture, it was very, very possible not to go down that path. And suddenly I realized, actually, things are a bit more complicated. This is a 5-second animation. There we go. 5 seconds of your life have now passed. Was any of this actually true? So let's take a look at some of those things that I was saying about the different personalities. So in Greek, I was saying I was more expressive, extroverted, free, all that kind of thing. You know, but actually, was this really what was going on? Was this really everybody's experience of the Greek language, or was this just my experience of the Greek language? Because let me tell you, we have a reputation in Greece of being very extroverted, of partying, of drinking, but there's a lot of introverted Greeks out there. You know, there were some at this conference not too long ago, and you know, within that language, it's very possible to be whoever you want to be. So really, my impressions of the Greek language, my stereotypes about it, were a product of one thing. They were a product of the fact that that was my experience of the Greek language. Those were the people I was speaking to, and that was what the Greek language meant for me. Okay? Of course, the Greek language for me felt about community and it felt about family, because I used Greek to engage with my family and my community. Obvious, right? If I'd been using Greek to kind of go to the supermarket and count vegetables because that was my job, I'd probably think Greek was a very mathematical language. It's just that this was the context. You know, Greek also to me it offered a sense of belonging in a country that I didn't grow up in, a country where I feel like I've always had to, you know, make an effort to try and belong in Greece, make an effort to make it obvious that that's part of my identity, because you can't see it in my face, you can't hear it when I speak English, and, you know, when I say I'm from London, no one has a clue that there's this whole other side of me which belongs here, you know. And as for the cultural stereotypes about Greeks following rules, I mean, I told you I cut up a bus once in London while listening to London Greek radio and then blamed it on the fact that I was listening to London Greek radio. Really, I just committed a traffic offence, you know, and you can do that in any language, you know. And finally, this idea of being free. I mean, yes, the word order thing was important to me. I've always felt a lot of flexibility that I can put the words wherever I want. But maybe the reason why I was free was actually because I was on holiday. I didn't have to go to school. You know, and so we were free in Greece. We didn't have anything to do. We just used to walk around and swim and eat tzatziki and kind of, you know, talk about Greek word order. That's what my childhood looked like. So maybe these things start to come undone. Similar with German, right? I mean, okay, we talked about being logical, we talked about it being organized, but realistically for me, German was a school subject. I had to learn the logic, I had to study the rules, I studied the grammar like it was mathematics, just in order to make sure I could do my homework and pass my exams. That was my contact with German. You know, and I liked, you know, I thought German was a fun language because I had fun in German. It was as simple as that. It wasn't that German's a language that makes you have more fun. It's just that that was my experience. Similar with Russian, okay? What was I doing? I was studying literature. I was studying translation. I was studying the nuances between different words. So of course I'd begin to think that it was expressive. Of course I'd begin to have all of these things. But, you know, my point is that at a certain time in my life, I really believed that speaking Russian did this to me. I really believed that I changed when I took on another language. And then suddenly I realized that actually what was going on was that I was just taking on a different persona. It wasn't necessarily a universal persona to Russian, but it was a different persona. However, you know, I'm getting slightly ahead of myself with the slides. But what is causing the shifts, basically, is my question. What is it that is making us all believe, and so many of us actually report, the fact that we feel personality shift going on? Because I think there's a number of different factors at play, and that's what I'd just like to talk about now, and then talk about some ways that we can deal with them. Okay, so why do we shift personality? Why did I, in Russian, take on the persona of a rude guy from a provincial town? The first thing for me definitely was this. It was a lack of competence and it was a lack of vocabulary. I physically felt quite restricted speaking Russian because I couldn't find the words to express myself all the time. And so taking on this persona, taking on this accent, this gruffness, these mannerisms was a way of excusing that and was a way of kind of pushing that under the carpet, you know. Actually, I remember when I was living in Hungary, you know, my Hungarian has always been fairly patchy. But I remember thinking, well, maybe I could just get around the fact that I don't know any words whatsoever by pretending to be this kind of extremely introverted and monosyllabic guy who doesn't like human contact or eye contact. And Hungary kind of is an environment where people are not typically very extroverted, so it sort of worked. But I just kind of go into cafes and look down and say as little as possible. And that was my Hungarian persona. Okay, it wasn't that Hungarian turns you into that person. It was just that I didn't know enough Hungarian to be anyone else. I had to use very few words. Okay. As we talked about, a lot of the time that's been going on, I had been actively associating a specific language with specific cultural contexts and then extrapolating those cultural contexts into the whole experience of speaking that language. And that was a mistake. That wasn't what was going on. It's just that that was my experience of that language. Okay. And of course, another huge trap that many non-native speakers fall into when thinking about this question is the fact that normally you're speaking your non-native language in transactional scenarios. You're using the language to buy things. You're talking to people that you don't really have anything in common with, anything to talk about at all. So of course, you're just using your language to order things, to buy things. And as a result, it's very hard to develop a sense of how you'd use that language to really express yourself, because unless you've got the kind of friends that you can sit with and talk for hours about your dreams, worries, fears, and emotions, you're unlikely to actually have that experience learning another language, at least for a very long time, and definitely not as a beginner. Okay? And then the final reason why I think many of us do feel this personality shift when we speak another language is because there is a kind of personality theft when we learn another language. We actually do take on somebody else's personality. And normally that's the personality of our teacher. It's the personality of the people in our textbooks. It's the personality of people around us, because we're like sponges. We sit there, we listen to how people speak, and we try to emulate it. But as we're beginners, that personality cannot be us, because we just don't have the ability to express ourselves. We haven't found the way to get through it. Okay. This is, yep, we've done through all of this. So, yeah, why do we shift personality? I believe that this is an entirely artificial thing that happens. I don't think it's real. I think it's a narrative that we tell ourselves. And I think as we get better at learning a language, as we learn more vocabulary, and as we expose ourselves to different scenarios in which we get the chance to be ourselves, it starts to unravel, okay? So, you know, maybe you'll kind of shift personality to excuse the fact that your proficiency level is lacking. Maybe you'll get invited to a dinner party and be asked to carry a lot of plates, and then when you drop them, say, excuse me, I was thinking in Greek, and that's just part of Greek culture, you know. And the final thing that I wanted to say is that also I think we do have an idea that shifting personality, being able to take on other people's souls, see the world through other glasses, all of these nice things, it's a very, very romantic and very attractive idea, right? We all like the idea that if I learn Japanese, I'll start to see the world like a Japanese person. But there's also a danger here, because I believe this is a really limiting belief, and I believe that actually, if we allow it to go unchallenged, it could get slightly out of proportion. If I give you an example, recently I was talking to an educator from Australia, from Sydney, and he told me that in his school, the students are allowed to study 64 home languages. That's the languages that they speak in their families, languages they speak, you know, in their communities. They're able to take a qualification in those languages. But the only language that was not allowed to be studied at his school was Afrikaans. I was kind of like, wow, why? And he said, well, the problem with Afrikaans, and we have a lot of Afrikaans speakers in Sydney, is that Afrikaans is a language for gossip. Afrikaans is a language that people talk about other people in. You know, we know this happens in South Africa, that the Afrikaans speakers use Afrikaans to talk about everybody else in South Africa. And we just don't want that going on in our community because it's a gossipy language, you know. And I was like, wow. So you don't think that Zulu speakers gossip? Like, you should really come and meet my friends. Like, you know, you're going to change your whole perspective on that. But this is the kind of territory we start to wade into when we allow the idea that language gives us a personality to develop, because it allows people to say that there are useful languages and unuseful languages, there are positive languages and negative languages, and it allows people to think that some languages encourage behaviors and others don't, when we all know that's rubbish, right? Language, the language we speak, is available to you as a tool to express your personality, to express your identity to the people you're speaking with, and however you do that is up to you. So, why do we shift personality? It comes down to this. When there is a mismatch between the linguistic personality that we have in our first language and the personality that we have adopted in our additional language, we're likely to experience this phenomenon. Because we don't feel like ourselves, because we can't be ourselves, because we can't say the things we want to say, we can't make our normal jokes, we can't do our normal word plays, and that, in my experience, is what's wrong. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we fix that? How do we be ourselves in languages that are not ours? Well, I think the first thing to do and the first question to ask yourself is, what is it about your native language that allows you to be you that is missing in the language that you are learning? Ultimately, your first task is to know yourself, know how you use language, know the kinds of jokes you want to make, the kinds of references you want to make, and you know, just how are you going to use this really rich tool? And of course, the most obvious thing next is to learn more vocabulary. If you're finding yourself feeling constrained by the fact you don't know vocabulary, it's a very simple solution: learn more. Okay. But then another little tactic that I've been using recently, I mean, because of all the languages I speak, I think I'm the closest to being myself, apart from in English, in Greek. And that's simply because I've got a strong emotional connection and I've used it in the broadest number of contexts possible. But even then, every now and then, I'm struggling for words. I'm scrambling for things. I'm scrambling for expressions that I know if we were speaking English, I'd be able to say, but I can't say because I'm a heritage speaker. It's not my native language. So maybe this is an English thing that we can do, but maybe you can try it in your own native language. I now started throwing in English words when I don't know the Greek word when I'm speaking to my friends. And then I say, how do I say that? And they tell me, and gradually I learn. Okay, now it maybe sounds like cheating. I can see some horrified faces around the room. But I see it more as sticking like a plaster, which is British English for a Band-Aid, on a wound. Basically, you're fixing an immediate problem. You're fixing the fact that you don't know how to say something, and you're saying it, you're communicating, and you're turning that into a learnable experience. Okay? You also need to accept your imperfections. You need to, I mean, I think this is a really interesting area of language learning because it's about acting. And it's about role-playing, and it's about, I mean, for me, it was always a kind of game. Will they ever get the fact that I'm not from that country? Will I be able to pass as a native speaker? And I think when I was a lot younger, I used to put a lot of pressure on myself to be perfect in that language, to never make mistakes and to be authentic. And the most liberating thought I've ever had was to actually accept my imperfections, accept the fact that, hey, I'm speaking to people who've been speaking this language their whole life, and I just walked into the room 5 minutes ago. So of course I'm going to make mistakes. Of course I'm not going to know things. That's just logical. Okay. But the final thing that I recommend you guys do, and this has been an interesting thing that I've been looking at for the last year, is to find yourself a native speaker role model. Ooh, what is a native speaker role model? So let me tell you, so about a year ago, I left the island I was born in. I come from an island very close to France called the United Kingdom. And I traveled to the continent, which is called Europe. And I now live in a city called Barcelona, where there are two languages that are spoken, Spanish and Catalan. And we use these two languages on a daily basis. It's impossible that you live in Barcelona without having some contact with both languages. And you know, I'd lived in Valencia before, which is just down the coast, similarly bilingual. Valencian is very similar to Catalan. Some consider it to be the same language. Let's not go there. And so I expected really to arrive in Barcelona and to feel very at home, and to feel very much like I lived there, very much like I belonged there and that kind of thing. But actually, it was a very long process to get to that place. And one of the biggest problems I had is I had this voice in the back of my head that kept telling myself, you're a permanent tourist. You're never going to walk down the Rambla without someone trying to offer you a free walking tour, you know? Because what do people see when they see you? They just see a foreigner here, and they don't understand why you're here. And I don't know if anyone actually was thinking that, but I was thinking that. I was thinking, why am I here? How do I fit into this place? It doesn't make sense. I just threw my toys out of the pram because I wasn't happy about Brexit, got on a plane, and then kind of like now live on permanent vacation. I mean, it's ridiculous. You know, I have to go back to real life. But eventually those voices started to subside because I noticed that, I mean, one of the biggest problems I had was actually the language and expressing myself in Spanish. I've studied Spanish for maybe 15 years. I've never had problems speaking it when I've traveled to Spanish-speaking countries. I've always used it when I've been at the Polyglot conference. But living in a Spanish-speaking city of Barcelona, I felt very restrained. I couldn't be myself, and I couldn't tell people who I was. So gradually, I looked to my friends, and I looked to the friends I've known who've been there for 5 years or 6 years or more, and I started to think about the ways that they spoke Spanish and the kinds of expressions they used. And then I started to copy them. And then I started to notice that the reaction I was getting from people was changing. And that's when I first started to really think about this idea of having a role model in the language that you're learning. Because I was looking at how other people were dealing with the same problem that I was facing and how they were getting past it. And it was really, really working. So how do we choose a native speaker role model? I mean, I'm calling it a native speaker role model, but the example I just gave you was of someone who is not a native speaker, but who speaks Spanish so well that everybody thinks he's a native speaker, and that meant that I could get by. So I think the most important thing is that you need to choose somebody who inspires you. You need to choose somebody who you look up to and who you think is really, really cool, because this is the aspirational part of languages. You're choosing who you want to be, whose identity and whose personality most closely matches yours in your native language, and you're working out how to get there. So it's important that that person who's, oh, that's a terrible typo, I'm sorry, who should be W-H-O-S-E. We'll edit that out. It should be somebody whose educational, social, and professional background you aspire to, or perhaps matches yours, right? When I was going around Russia being incredibly rude to people, I realized that nobody understood that I kind of had a university education and did all that kind of thing, just because I was being rude. So that information wasn't coming across, okay? But the final thing which I think is important for choosing a role model in the language you're learning is it needs to actually be someone who's a bit of a public figure. You need to find somebody who's got interviews up, who's got videos, got recordings, so you can listen to those videos, you can watch them, and that you can study the way that they speak meticulously so that one day you can eventually become them. Now, as I mentioned, I've been living in Barcelona for a year, and of course the language which I was using the most when I arrived is Spanish. But the other language, the main language in fact of Barcelona, is not Spanish, it's Catalan. And Catalan is one of those languages that a lot of polyglots like to say they can speak because it's an easy win, right? You can fake it. You know, you speak French, you speak Spanish, you merge them, you put tomato on your bread, you're basically 60% there. But when I was living in Catalonia, I suddenly realized that this was not quite the case. I was not understanding what people were saying. I was stalling, and I was switching into Spanish the whole time, which is something I really didn't want to do, because I know that that can be a problem in terms of native speakers of Catalan using too much Spanish, and people get upset, and it's a whole issue. Watch the news. And so I realized that I have to make an effort. So who was I going to use, basically, as my native speaker role model for Catalan? With Catalan, it was a language that I had a high level of understanding of, but my production was weak. I couldn't really speak it very, very well. So I addressed that with a specific way of just forcing myself to watch TV, read the news, listen to the radio all of the time in Catalan, and just absorb, write everything down that I didn't know or didn't recognize, and eventually it started to come out. And there's this really cool series called Merli, which is also, actually Marli, we should say in the Barcelona dialect. And this is all about a Catalan school. It's 100% in Catalan, apart from a few scenes that switch into Spanish. And it's all about this kind of crazy, slightly kind of midlife crisis-y. His life is a bit of a mess, but he's really cool and smart and really kind of charismatic and a good public speaker teacher called Merli. And this guy basically became my role model for Catalan. I would watch every single TV show, and I would listen so carefully to what he would say. I would pause it, I'd repeat after him, I'd look up all of the words, and I just thought, you know, if I sit here and imagine the Catalan speaker I want to be in 5 years' time, I want to be able to use the language the way this TV character does. So that was who I chose. Not a real person, but it was really, really effective. Okay. And so this is basically how we go about it. So you need to listen super, super carefully to the way your native speaker speaks. You need to make notes of specific phrases, mannerisms, expressions, and anything really that's distinctive about the way this person speaks. You need to try and find out, ask yourself, you know, what's the way this person expresses their feelings, their emotions, their opinions? How do they tell anecdotes? What are the words they're using which you're not using, which mean their stories are funny and yours sound like a foreigner babbling their way through a language they don't really speak? And again, focus on learning any new vocabulary that you pick up from that person, because really we're just trying to learn as much as we can from them and work out what we can borrow from them. And then, you know, finally, the final step is once you've done all of this, you've essentially assumed that person's personality. You've stolen it. You've done exactly what I've told you not to do when learning a language. The final step is the most important one, because now you need to work out what is it about the way this person presents themselves, the way they speak, the way they express their personality, which you like, which matches who you want to be, and what is it you want to change? And this is the most exciting part, because this is the part of learning a language where we start to find ourselves, where we start to find our own personality. And I guarantee you, when you get to that stage, the notion that the language you speak changes your personality, changes the way you think, and changes the way you see the world will really start to disappear. I think the most magical part of being a multilingual person, of being a polyglot, is that moment where suddenly you realize that you've been talking a language for hours and you haven't felt constrained. You haven't felt like you're choosing your words. You felt that you can be you. And the ironic thing about being a polyglot, about learning lots of languages, is that actually that experience can be quite hard to reach if we spread our objectives, we spread our languages too thin. Now, okay, serious time now. When we talk about polyglots to the rest of the world, there's a criticism that sometimes is given to us, which is that, oh, but you guys, you just dabble, right? You learn a few phrases in this, a few phrases in that, and then you stick all of your flags and your silly badges and go on the news. And, you know, I've been learning Luxembourgish for 43 years, and I'm only a B1. You know, I mean, this is something that I'm sure people have heard these kind of things said before. And first of all, I think we all know why we don't, I think we all know why we take all that with a bit of salt, right? We all understand why that's not necessarily a valid argument. But at the same time, I think there's something to it. Because where I am with my languages, I've studied 15 languages. I speak 5 at a level that I feel comfortable using, although every now and then there's good days, there's bad days. But since I've started on this journey with Catalan and with Spanish and really trying to be myself in those languages that I'm using every day, I've discovered a whole new field of challenge and a whole new field of excitement, which is to reach those advanced levels and to reach the point where I can be me unapologetically, which is something that I didn't have before. So, you know, this is about that level. This is about the advanced levels when we're trying to achieve that, okay? And another little thing, I mean, okay. I had a really difficult conversation with a friend of mine once where he said to me, so why is it that you think you've learnt so many languages? And I was like, I don't know, I just like languages. He said, no, but why is it? Why do you think that you, as a teenager, while everyone else was out, as Lindy was talking about from her school, kind of getting drunk and like chatting to people that they liked, why were you at home learning languages? What was it that it was? And I was like, well, I don't know, I just like languages. And eventually I started to realize that actually, for me, languages have always been a kind of escape. Languages have always been a way to get out of my immediate surroundings. And the more languages, the better. The more escapes, the more frontiers, the more kind of exciting new places. But I think the message that I want to give you today with this idea about personality and language is that I think that only gets us so far. And I think really the exciting challenge is when we commit to languages, when we keep going with them, when we understand that there's no fluent in X number of months. There's no quick way to get quick wins. Ultimately, language learning is the one activity, the one pastime you can do, which however much you know, there's always going to be something left. There's always going to be more to learn. If my teacher in Russia told me, learning a language is like rowing against the current. The moment you stop rowing, you start floating back. And really, with this idea of languages, with this idea of personality shift, I think this is what it's about. It's about taking it to the next level. So that's the thought that I want to leave with you guys. We've talked a little bit about, does language shift happen? Why I don't think it does. Why I think ultimately there's reasons why we think it happens, but it doesn't. And I think this is the point where I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention and throw open the room to some questions and comments. Anything you'd like to say?
My dentist is Japanese. Her husband is also Japanese. They've lived in Boston for 20 years, fluent in English, both professors at Tufts, both very highly educated dentists. After 20 years in America, both native Japanese speakers, my dentist told me if she wants to ask her husband to wash the dishes, she has to do it in English. And that's because if she does it in Japanese, first of all, she will have to use deferential, humble, feminine language, which makes her feel humiliated. And secondly, if she asks her husband to wash the dishes in Japanese, her husband will be furious and outraged and offended. But if she says in English, please wash the dishes, he will do it without any complaint and not be offended.
So that's super interesting. And I'd just like to say back to that as a native English speaker, if someone said to me, please wash the dishes, I wouldn't respond well. Okay, to me it would sound really rude. Okay, I mean, obviously I'm looking for an excuse not to wash the dishes. That's, you know, let's just put that on the table. But the other thing is that when you've got two non-native speakers, you can be more direct and you can skip the formalities and you could skip all of the personality just because it doesn't register on either side. But if someone said to me, please wash the dishes, I'd be like, well, they're really annoyed at me, right? And I'd expect someone to say, hey, would you mind, you know, I think it's possibly your turn to kind of do the washing up today. Would that be okay? I mean, that's how we would express that. So I hear what you're saying, right? But I think let's not convolute that into thinking that English is an empowering language or English enables a conversation to happen that can't happen in Japanese. I think it's just that those cultural connotations maybe are not present for those two people in that specific context when for other people it's there.
I thank you. This was a very interesting talk, and I enjoyed it a lot. And it kind of ties in with what I've been reading recently, Slavoj Žižek and interpassivity. I think this is a lot of what we're experiencing as language learners. That for those not familiar, he says it, for example, about Western leftists who are interpassive in enjoying the thought of some country or other rebelling against capitalism, say, and in order so that they themselves don't have to do it. So we're kind of maybe some people here enjoying the thought of German being a very logical and orderly language, so that they themselves don't have to be it, or or maybe even to be it, to express a different part of their own personality because it is allowed, because it's expected, because they think German makes them do it, as a way to express a part of themselves that they otherwise could not express. So on the one hand, I really appreciate your thinking that we should be trying to be ourselves in every language that we encounter, and obviously not be rude just because we think it is expected. But I would also urge people to think, if I really enjoy the idea of the Japanese people being so traditional and polite and orderly and so on, maybe that is a part of myself that I would like to bring out in all of my languages.
Thank you very much, Gita. I think it's a very valuable contribution.
Bona tarda, veí.
Hola, com vas?
Molt bé. I've just said that good afternoon, neighbor. I also live in Barcelona. Just a small comment on Catalan and Spanish. I started to work in their really Catalan environment, and I'm the only foreigner in their Catalan, and there also obviously there are some Spaniards, and they usually speak Catalan on some, if there is someone like Spanish speaker, so they switch to Spanish obviously. And in my case, so it was really interesting that they Catalan speakers, they're really encouraging. So if you what happens with dominant languages, they usually they continue to speak at that language, right? With the Catalan, they encourage you know, to speak and study it, because in some cases there were meetings, they continue speaking in Catalan because they wanted to encourage me to speak that language. Sometimes even call conference, and they really encouraged, and this was I find really encouraging, you know, to practice this language like Catalan or like not so dominant languages, right? And here also I have a question for you. And how do you find being a English speaker to practice languages? Because, you know, for instance, in my case, it's like my native languages, Ukrainian, Russian, not so many people speak that language. But in your case, how was it difficult to find people who really practice? Because obviously there are a lot of people that want to practice their skills in English, right?
Thank you, yeah. Well, I think this English speaker thing is possibly what puts a bit more pressure on us to assimilate into the culture and to work on pronunciation a bit more. Because what I've found is that if I can sound convincing enough to stop someone moving into English, then they won't do it. But for example, we go, hola, buenos días. Quisiera preguntar si tenéis una mesa para 3 personas. Es que viene mi mujer y queremos comer algo, you know, algo bueno, no algo malo. Even if I'm speaking like that, where like, you know, I'm actually not necessarily, to my knowledge, making mistakes or using wrong words. But there's always someone who'll be like, yes, sir, absolutely. I mean, you can have this table right here. And it's like, oh, God, here we go. I feel like as native English speakers, we have to perform a bit more to get over that plausibility threshold so that people don't respond back to us in English. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing you can do is just keep going. Keep going and going and going and going. And it's like, you know, who blinks first, right? But when I'm in that situation, they always blink first.
Okay, let's give a big hand to